You're listening to the Idioticon podcast. My name is Ramon Bloomberg. This is the first series of the podcast, and it is called Oblique Effects. In this episode, I'm talking to Antoine Bousquet, whose recent book, The Eye of War, Military Perception from the Telescope to the Drone, came out with the University of Minnesota Press in 2018. Antoine writes that a martial gaze roams our planet, from the watchful satellites peering down from their silent orbits to the infrasonic sensors probing its subterranean and subaquatic depths. Our contemporary condition is rapidly converging on a globalized targeting capable of tracking and eliminating an entity wherever it is found. Another tasty quote is, "The self-determining subject today seems nowhere more precarious than in the military assemblage enmeshing the human ever more deeply within arrays of perceptual prosthetics and dense thickets of cybernetic control loops." So there's quite a lot to talk about, and that's what we do. So without further ado, we'll just get to it. I'm here with Antoine Bousquet, and we're going to talk about his book, which is The Eye of War, Military Perception from the Telescope to the Drone, which is out, University of Minnesota Press, was out 2019? 18, okay, 2018. So first of all, it's a really fantastic book, as I told you. I really enjoyed reading it. So it's a fantastic book. It's kind of a very dense and, I would say, pretty quick cruise through the history of military perception, all the way from sort of the perspective to today. If I could it's a major contribution. It's a sort of resource that we're all going to be using for a long time. And so just to start on I wanted to start on the sort of bridge between this one and your last book, which was The Scientific Way of Warfare, Order and Chaos on the Battlefields of Modernity, out 2009, Hearst and Company. Yeah. Which is how I got to know your work. Right, so I came from this sort of, and for me, one of the central conceits of the book, or one sort of overriding line that goes through Eye of War, is a declining trust of military institutions in the human perceptive capability of kind of truth making, in a way. I mean, that kind of reads through everything. Through every sort of moment of technological discovery and rationalization, and sort of metrology of perception is just a move away from the human observer, the individual human observer's ability to know what's going on, in a way. So that for me was a sort of logical move, obviously, from the scientific way of warfare. So I guess what I wanted to just open with maybe is the sort of the relation of perception to science more generally.
Well, so the first book, The Scientific Way of Warfare, was an attempt to grapple with the problem of military organization as it had traversed the modern period. And the kind of conceptual setup in the book was to think about this problem of organization as being a tangle between the forces of order and chaos. That warfare involves highly ordered processes. Military institutions are among the most kind of ordered institutions we can think of, and that are ordered precisely because they have to submit and resist the centrifugal forces of the battlefield. And indeed, for these organizations to prevail, they need to push their enemies into a state of disarray or chaos. Now, what that required for me to do was to think about, or what I wanted to do is to think about the relationship of scientific thinking in relationship to this, to note that, in fact, there's also a relationship between order and chaos, a much broader one that could be found in scientific inquiry, but in fact most human culture, which is precisely about identifying regularities, rules, finding order where otherwise we might just be observing a chaotic phenomena. And I think science has had a variety of explanations for that, from the Newtonian synthesis and early mechanism, down to contemporary sciences of complexity and chaos. In fact, one of the trends has been to make room for chaos in some ways, but still with the ends being to have greater predictability and control. So this is what I was looking at in the context of military organization, the ways in which through successive scientific regimes, mechanism, thermodynamics, cybernetics, and chaos and complexity, military organizations have thought about what they do in different ways, structured often around certain key technologies, such as the clock, the engine, the computer, and the network, technologies that are both material, they have physical effects, they are the dominant technological artifacts of the age, but also metaphors. They're models for the way in which the world is run. So the Clockwork Universe produces clockwork armies in the 18th century that are highly drilled and disciplined, unfold like clockwork mechanisms. Engines become models for thermodynamic processes in the universe and in human bodies and in nature. And they are also ways in which to think about the military, increasingly a militarized and industrialized military. And in the 20th century, with the rise of the information sciences, increasingly it's about control, feedback processes, information loops, and so on. So what I then once I finished that book, which was my original doctoral research, I was thinking about where to go next, and it seemed like a logical step to move from organization to perception. Because, of course, the end point of this book on organization was to think about the role of information, which, of course, has always played an important role, but perhaps has become a more self-conscious role since the information sciences and in the current information age. And perception was one way of approaching that, of thinking about how do military organizations, military assemblages acquire information in the world, and how does that correlate with their actions? And in doing so, is thinking through the positionality of the human within increasingly sophisticated systems.
Often when I'm reading about things, for example, like facial recognition, you hear things about machine vision. And I wonder about the distinction between terms when we're talking about these kind of sensing or perception operations. It's also the initial question I was talking about as to how to talk about the theme of this podcast. But so you have sort of vision, imaging, sensing, perception, sight. What is the category is this all under perception, or there's this, we were talking about the distinction between remoteness and intimacy. It's all bound up somehow in this kind of scalar question in a way, isn't it?
So, I mean, perception, I suppose, is the kind of master category that I deploy in the book, and in that sense I borrow from Paul Virilio's Logistics of Perception, I think, which is a very kind of powerful concept in the sense that the logistical frame, I think, is a useful one, because logistics is really it's the science of movement in many ways. So, and Virilio's insight was to extend this to information and to perception, and the book in many ways is an attempt to map that logistics, and hopefully to do so in a way that adds something to Virilio's original contribution. Within that, and one of the things I wanted to do in the book was to think as systematically as possible, and to offer something like a structural outline or functional outline of those logistics, which then resulted in these later categories of sensing, which is to say the ways in which systems acquire information through sense perception, imaging, the forms of representation, primarily visual but perhaps not entirely visual, representation of these sense perceptions, and mapping, which is the correlation of these sense perceptions with geospatial frameworks, because the sense in which I'm thinking about perception in a military context is in the context of targeting, which obviously requires a correlation with Euclidean space. These categories are not ones that I started off with. So these grew out organically from investing the empirical field and thinking for quite a long time how I would organize all the information that I was finding, all the different kinds of systems that I was encountering. I didn't want to go for a strictly chronological text, because I think that would have been quite unruly. although within those sections there is a general chronological development. But I felt in the end that these three concepts of sensing, imaging, and mapping worked quite well because although they're constantly entangled, and I make the point early on that really you can apply these to simple embodied human vision. The eye senses light and projects it into an image on the retina, and the brain makes estimations of distance on the basis of these images. All of this, of course, is a single process, and we experience it as precisely as a single process. But nonetheless, it's possible to distinguish between them. And so the book was organized around those categories as a way of formalizing those principles, investing distinct technological fields while constantly drawing on the connections that are woven between them, and that have become ever more intimate the more information feedback loops accelerate and proliferate.
Yeah, it's really interesting because if in your first book you're looking at a sort of the development of a scientific, sort of the co-development of a scientific field with military techniques, which with the clock, the computer, the network, they're not only building a kind of operational mechanism, they're also building a model for what the world will look like. And in your categories of perception, it might be something similar in the way that vision. So if Virilio talks about a logistics of perception, it's also a boomerang effect where perception becomes sort of systematized through these machines that then are seen as having vision in a way. It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways in which... So the difference between the two books, I suppose, in terms of the ways the conceptual apparatus was developed, is that in the case of the first book, I kind of started with the concepts, with the categories, with the key technologies, and then looked at the ways in which they were embodied in military systems. And often these could be quite more or less explicit in the writings or the thinkings of contemporaneous military actors. In the context of the second book, really these categories kind of grew more organically from the research, and were not so much they're not terms of art, let's say, within the military itself,
right?
And they are kinds of ways to label a set of underlying activities and processes that are, I think, imperfectly, the awareness of which is kind of imperfect within the military itself. So it's kind of trying to rationalize to some extent what is implicit in what has been going on, as opposed to start from the kind of big concepts and then try and find them reflected in.
So this makes me want to sort of jump to my last note that I made, but which is about working with military material. I've had my own experiences with it also, but you much more. How do you find parsing the material that's available on sort of contemporary technologies that the military claims certain capabilities for, but a lot of it must be read through a sort of veil of marketing speak? So how did that go?
I mean, there's always a risk, I think, when you write about military technology that you get is to get caught up in the kind of boosterism that's involved in pitching this technology, and whether it's in with a kind of wide-eyed gee whiz kind of way, or conversely in a kind of dystopian mode. So I think that there's obviously something you have to be mindful of. I think one of the ways in which I try to navigate that is through very kind of consciously putting everything within a kind of historical perspective. Right. So I didn't start, my general mindset was, well, if I'm going to look at a particular technology, say guided missiles, then I want to find the earliest guided missile. Try to not to start with the latest kind of technology, but with its earliest embodiments or predecessors, even those that were perhaps completely flawed or didn't work. So, for instance, looking at B.F. Skinner's pigeon-guided missile in the Second World War. I think the value of doing that is dual. First, by going back to more historical instances of technology, then you get away from some of the contemporary hype. You can look at it in the cold light of day about how the technology performed. You can look at contemporary manuals, which are not really about trying to sell the technology, but just to explain it for the purpose of its operation and so on. But also, I think there's a value in going back to the oldest embodiments of those technologies, because sometimes the operational mechanisms are more nakedly visible in that kind of inchoate or primitive form. And it also, I think, what's surprising very often to me, and I hope it'll be surprising to readers as well, is how old these ideas actually are. And so one of the charges...
How old they are?
Yes, how often the idea of that technology it precedes its actual real operational influence for a very long time. That you can go back to the First World War and find drone aircraft, and they're complete marginalia in the history of the First World War. They probably had no real impact on the battlefield, but people were already thinking about unmanned aerial vehicles at the time, and thinking about ways in which they might be used that are not that different from where we are. So our imagination, our martial imagination, often precedes its realization by quite some time.
So your book is filled with these amazing anecdotes, like the B.F. Skinner pigeon-guided torpedo. So if I remember correctly, the pigeons were supposed to be pecking at an image. How did that work? You have to.
So B.F. Skinner, for just to refresh anyone's memory, is arguably the most prominent psychologist of the 20th century. He became very well known after the war for his work in behaviorism, and who conducted, in fact, a number of experiments in conditioning pigeons. In fact, this is something he was already at work on during the Second World War, in which he came up with the idea of a pigeon-guided missile. So the way in which that would work was you would train pigeons to peck at the image of a ship. This was to be an anti-naval weapon. You do this by showing them a film projection of an approaching ship, and you would reinforce the pecking behavior, expecting the bird to peck at the image, by feeding them, rewarding them effectively when they performed as they were supposed to. Mechanism would then be, well, once the pigeons were inside the missile head, which is where they were destined to be, their pecking at the image of the ship would emit correct necessary rectifications to the guidance system, the navigational system of the missile. So effectively, the pigeons were supposed to keep pecking at the ship until the moment of impact. And
this was inside of some kind of camera obscura?
Yes, it would have been effectively a camera obscura. Skinner came up eventually with the idea that it'd have to be 3 pigeons in the warhead, because then it would be, in his words, a kind of democratic system. They could 2 pigeons could outvote 1. You could get away from the consequences of an aberrant pigeon. So it's a kind of interesting idea of democracy.
Well, no, it's very reminiscent of consensus protocols in blockchain technologies today.
Right. Yes.
It's a sort of early blockchain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I like the pigeon-guided missile a lot, in fact, as an example, because in some ways, I think, the kind of question that maybe should keep us up at night a little bit is whether we are the pigeons. Whether, to what degree we are the operators of systems, increasingly operators of systems that obey to rationalities that perhaps escape us or increasingly slip beyond our control, and whether in the process we might be the vectors of our own annihilation, which is precisely what these pigeons were tasked with doing.
That's interesting. But that sort of points towards the larger, I would say, scalar question of the humanness of systems. Well, it gets to the end of the book, actually, which we'll reserve to the end.
Sure.
I was really interested in the discussion around the aesthetics of perception technologies. There's this, I'm going to quote from your book, on 19th century photogrammetry. And I think it's talking about operative images from the Harun Farokhi reference, but it's Jan von Brevern, and he says, whatever aesthetic quality contemporaries may have seen in photogrammetric images, they were merely the waste product of purely utilitarian aims, measurability, comparability, precision. And I was thinking, is that really true? Is it only because there must be a closer binding between aesthetic appreciation and utilitarianism? What do you think?
Well, one of the things that interests me is that in many of the accounts that we have of media technologies is to a large extent the ways in which they've been studied and approached is through their cultural significance, through the meaning making that these images or these various media produce. And I think that of course is very true, and we have a kind of very rich rendering of that. But I think what gets lost a little bit is the functionalist dimension of certain media technologies. And notably what I think is very significant is the way in which photography is in many ways the automation of the production of perspectival images, which is itself beyond the kind of artistic representations that it provides. And again, we have a rich history about how perspectival images are a reflection of the rise of humanist subject and a depiction of the world as in the ways of, say, Berger's ways of seeing, kind of reading about the cultural significance of these images. But perspectival images are also acts of measurement. They contain within the image the accurate measurement of the proportions and the relative positions of objects in a field, and that's what renders this image liable to be integrated within functional systems, notably military ones. So photogrammetry is effectively a technique developed in the 19th century which purports to read measurements of space, objects within space, on the basis of photographic images. You take a photographic image because you know the laws of perspective, because you can manipulate geometric projection, you can extract proportions from it. It's one of the mechanisms by which you can produce kind of artificial machine vision. It has its flaws, but the principles are fairly sound. So when we think about this question of images that don't have any kind of aesthetic dimension, well, on the one hand, there are very clearly images being produced today serve an entirely functional purpose. When you think about most images today are not seen by human eyes. They're video cameras in factories or in streets or wherever it might be, or sensors of any various types, and algorithms are monitoring these images. Well, for them, they're not so much images than streams of data, and detecting information or picking up information that's relevant, perhaps acting on it in automated fashion. So these images are not produced with any spectator in mind. There's, unless we think these algorithms have their own aesthetic preferences, but work purely as a cog within a functional purpose, and are therefore as aesthetic as other kind of mechanical elements. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that we can't find aesthetic value or beauty in those images, and I am very interested in that aspect of things. And one of the reasons the book has so many images, and some of the reasons I chose these images, are because they speak to us on an aesthetic register. Very few of these images were ever taken with an aesthetic goal in mind, but yet they do affect us in an aesthetic manner. And I think that's an important way in which to engage with the subject matter, but I think in general with the world, in the sense that it speaks to us at a different register from the semiotic level of language. And I think that's kind of something I wanted to get at with the book, that the images are part of the meaning being conveyed through the book by creating kind of an aesthetic experience as well as a more straightforwardly cerebral one.
Yeah, no, I mean it comes through. Also, you've been producing a lot of images yourself, I think, daily. And there are images in this book which are amazing. What comes to mind immediately is one of the French listening station, which is unbelievable. Maybe I'll borrow it from you and put it on the site or something.
So these are sound rangers from generally the first half of the 20th century, and there's a great line of them. In fact, they all look pretty fantastic objects.
They look like reverse tubas or something.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But I've been doing some new work on sort of the way that machine vision is sort of either imagined or really is built into ubiquitous CCTV systems. You're talking about your kind of algorithmic spectator of produced images. It just made me think of that because there's a distinction between the camera technology, the lens, and whatever kind of chips are in there, and the storage stuff, right? So in Dubai, there's a case I've been working on in Dubai where you can clearly see the visual regime of the city, kind of visual economy of the smart city. What's really quite funny and sad too is that so they spend a lot of time worrying about the resolution of the camera image, but of course once you get to the storage of it, it's just purely functional because you need to cram as many as you can in there. So once it gets stored, the stuff is unusable for facial recognition, but coming through the wires into the storage, it's like very high quality HD. So it's actually for sort of this imagined spectator, right? You imagine a security guard watching thousands of TV screens, but he's not there or she's not there. It just doesn't exist. It's funny. Yeah, there was something that I wanted to ask about, just sticking on the image for a second, around the electronic imaging and the shift in the material ontology of the image. Maybe you can just discuss what that would mean.
So I think when we look at the history of photography, and again, I think it's useful to think of it as the culmination of a century-long process to automate or assist and then automate the production of perspectival images. So from very early on, when these first images were produced, there were attempts were sought in order to assist the production of them, because otherwise you'd need to be quite a good mathematician, quite a good geometrist. And artists necessarily want to get on with their painting and not necessarily have to think about those things too much. So various aids were developed, various instruments. Eventually things such as the camera lucida and the camera obscura were used to at least help with the projection of images onto two-dimensional surfaces, which individuals would then transcribe. But the invention of photography comes about in the 19th century with the discovery of photochemical processes that allow the fixing of intensities of light on these chemicals. And throughout most of the history of photography, photography was synonymous with that photochemical process. What happens in the second half of the 20th century is this digitization of the image, which comes about through the development of sensor technology that allows the registering of photon intensities into numerical data. So actually, when you think about what a digital image is, and that applies really to all the digital cameras that we use, is that what digital image actually is a statistical ensemble. It's a set of numbers registering these various intensities according to discrete points of measurement, the individual pixel of the image. So the digital image, as something that we can actually see with our own eyes, is a second order representation of those various data points. Whereas the original photochemical photography was part of a single analog process where the image was the fixation of those photochemical substances as they had been struck by light. So that has significant implications. I mean, one of the reasons why the drive for the development of digital imaging in the first place was the ease of transmission, and there were early attempts to mediate this through television technologies. Part of the drive for this was satellite observation, because with the early technology, you effectively sent the satellite into orbit with buckets of film. It shot all that film, sent that film back down to Earth. Someone had to go and collect it, and once you ran out of film, well, then you had a hunk of metal just orbiting the Earth. Yeah. With digital imaging, you can put a satellite up for decades and it can keep transmitting images continuously. So that was a significant driver. But then two further consequences flow from the digital image. One is, because it's rendered as data immediately, it's much more amenable to algorithmic processing. Technically, of course, you can take a classical photography and scan it but ultimately you're cutting out that kind of intermediary. You're working with data from continuously, and so that's digital imaging was a very important step in the development of machine vision systems. Yeah. The flip side of that as well is that since the image is merely an aggregate of data points, then effectively you can create virtually any image. Mm-hmm. You're only limited by your imagination. All you need to do is summon the right kind of ensemble of data. So computer graphics are effectively precisely that. So that simultaneously to machine vision, we have what I've called machine visions, which is increasing the ability to create any kind of visual environment that we can imagine. And of course, we live saturated with these images today.
This is the sort of fake stuff, deep fakes that are happening now. I think Manovich, so in the distinction between the digital image and the film image, Manovich came up with this idea that the film image, the original kind of first order image, is a kind of indexical, has an indexical quality to it, because you get whatever you have when you take the lens cap off the lens. But yeah, so the digital would be the kind of painterly. He calls it a kind of painterly, or return to a painterly, because you can manipulate. The digital image is just completely wide open to manipulation and mutability. Whereas the indexical image was much more difficult to do that. Yeah,
that's what Mitchell was already talking about, I think, quite insightfully in the 90s with the reconfigured eye. Mm-hmm. He's talking about the thinking already about the impact of digital imaging. Mm-hmm. And yes, you're right, with the emergence of deepfakes, we're now kind of seeing some of the latest developments of it.
It's pretty amazing, actually.
It's very striking, and it's pretty terrifying, because I think it is deeply corrosive of our ability to distinguish between what we might call the real and its various kinds of simulations.
Compression algorithms already had that kind of probabilistic character to them, that they would I think JPEG compression, part of how it works is that they guess what certain pixels are going to be in order to compress what the image is. So there's an interesting sort of conjunction of mutability and economy of image in a way.
Probability is I think a really interesting question, one that I don't explore much in the book, but I've been thinking about for quite some time, because it plays a major role precisely in this process of ordering that we see in science and in wider kind of societal organizations. You think about the way in which science has progressed in the last 100, 150 years or so. It has been in quite significant part by making room for probability. And that was something that was originally very offensive to early scientists who wanted the certainty of Newton's equations. Mm-hmm. And the idea that you had to then think about probabilities, statistical aggregates, was a very new idea, but was necessary in order to deal with the large numbers of particles involved in, say, statistical mechanics. Even more so, of course, in the bizarre world of quantum mechanics. And this has this, is reflected as well in the various engineering advances connected to war. So notably, the processes of targeting that I identify through tracking and guidance increasingly involve probabilistic assessments, both about the position of the future position of a target, or simply in dealing with the kinds of noise that enters into the various systems at this level. So probability has become, I think, is one of the tools of technical and social governance.
It seems almost as if the further removed the human eye is from what it's supposed to be looking at and understanding the veracity of, the more you need to insert a kind of probabilistic view, sort of this distance, because you can't see it.
Yeah. It's an interesting kind of relinquishing of a certain form of predictability in order to get more control. So this parallels with the development of chaos theory, which a big part of it is deterministic in a sense. So it doesn't actually imply a belief in a in a probabilistic world, but it says our measurements can only be probabilistic, and on that basis, we can't obtain the kind of point predictions that previous theories would advocate, but we gain new insights through that. We can learn about patterns of behavior that would otherwise elude us because we think of them as in probabilistic terms.
But it's super fascinating, the probabilistics. I mean, it just reminds me of the financial conversation I had with Emily Rosamond not long ago, because that's all sort of probabilistic futures are sort of marked, or sort of statements around the probabilistic future are made in order to make a value judgment of the present. You're looking through kind of scope, which is looking at the future in order to see the present. I mean, it's quite amazing, actually, and that's sort of a guiding. It's a guiding epistemology of our time, I think, in everything. So would you say that in military perception or military epistemologies there is a financialization going on in a certain way?
I think there's various ways in which military or intelligence organizations try to control the future that involves thinking in terms of futures, both in chronological futures, but also in that kind of financial sense that relies on assessments of risk, but also, in fact, in also trying to garner control over the future through, there's a form of what we might call military hyperstition, where the military increasingly, in my experience, likes to play with sometimes quite far-reaching visions of the future as a way of making these futures more likely to happen, right? So often I think the military finds that they want to hear from science. They found that, for instance, they get better results talking to science fiction writers than they get from futurists. That the science fiction writers kind of give them a more compelling and perhaps helpful vision, and ultimately more predictive vision than the professional futurists. So the contemporary advanced militaries are so caught in this kind of headlong process of innovation that it's just become a modus operandi for them, where they want to be thinking about what will war be in 50 years' time, and how can they, be the first to reach that future. But of course, by imagining and summoning these visions of future, they contribute in, of course, bringing them about. The future is not a fixed place that's just waiting to be encountered. It's something that we're bringing forth.
It's amazing, but it's also, we're talking, we talk about the military, but it's kind of the U.S. military is the central. I mean, they're the big ones, right?
Yes, it's clear that the U.S. Are the main drivers right now, certainly, and this is where most of the technology is coming from. When we think about, it's well known, of course, that the U.S. spends more money on its military than many other states, but that difference is even starker when you look at research and development.
Yeah, but what's striking? It comes again. It's this sort of displacement of the human in a way. But what's striking about the way the military sees things, is the battlefield for them. I mean, what is the battlefield? The battlefield is sort of like life on the planet in a way. The battlefield is life. And they're looking at it in this way that they understand it as totally chaotic, and basically unstable, where they need to manage that instability with their own kind of OODA loop or whatever. They're getting inside the OODA loop of living creatures. It's very strange.
And of course, the way in which the military thinks about what it does is always in terms of the threat, the adversary. Of course, one of the difficulties since the end of the Cold War is that it's become more and more difficult to be clear what the threat, who the enemy is, and I think the U.S. military has been split between preparing for peer competition, China, Russia, where they can more or less anticipate what that might look like, or at least they're more comfortable with what that might. But at the same time, these are hardly wars that one could wish to be involved in, because they are potentially annihilatory, and so in that sense perhaps not all that probable, or whether the threat comes from a multiplicity of non-state actors, or climate change, or whatever it might be. So imaginations run wild accordingly. But it's also, I think, important to see that although the US is the engine for this, first of all, a lot of this innovation now is really coming through the civilian sector. Particularly when we think about information technology, this is now an artificial intelligence. These were things that the U.S. military or the U.S. Public sector kick-started originally, but now all the leading technology is coming from the private sector, and the U.S. military is kind of piggybacking on it. The second thing is the phrase that of the early cyberneticist Norbert Wiener in 1949. He said that in the long run, there's no difference between arming ourselves and arming our enemies, by which he meant that any technological innovation we make very likely, very, very quickly will diffuse to others, and then we're looking for the next technological advantage. So it's presented as a kind of race, but it's a never-ending race, and the technologies that one military may acquire for its security may become the source of its insecurity in very quickly. Yeah. And much of the technology that we're talking about today, from drones to artificial intelligence, are ones that are likely to diffuse much faster than, say, something like nuclear technology, because the costs of entry are not that great, and any attempts at control over the diffusion is going to be very difficult.
Yeah, which leads, so one thing that must have been difficult in writing this book is to sort of make boundaries around what is military and what is not military, because as you said, it seems that everything is. I mean, do you get the sense? I mean, first of all, was that difficult to do, and because if there is an increasing blur between a military and non-military life. Certainly the case with sort of information wars, things like that. How did you manage? Did you have a strategy to sort of ring fence the book and not go to certain places that you might have?
So there were some things I had to try and steer clear of, not because I didn't think they were important, but because it was necessary to just limit the remit of the book. So, for instance, with regard to perception, I tried to stay in the military context quite firmly connected to the ultimate problem of targeting and thinking of targeting in fairly narrow kinetic terms. Because of course when you start bringing in perception, you could start talking about intelligence operations and psychological operations and influence operations and all these kinds of things, but that would have potentially opened up a much bigger field that I think was just simply too unwieldy. So that was one of the choices I made early on, and that perhaps was one of the ways in which I bounded what was to be within kind of the military sphere and what wasn't. But I think as I the hook throughout the peg throughout most of the book that I fell on was to think about certain kinds of weapon systems and to draw strands from that. So in that sense, it wasn't necessarily too difficult to identify weapon systems, but simultaneously, I felt it was necessary to keep, to follow those strands and to show at different times where, how these met kind of more civilian developments. In fact, part, I think, of the book's purpose is to show that some of the things we think of as we're used to thinking often mostly in the civilian context often have either a military origin or their military employment is a big part of their history. Take a very early example, the telescope. Most of the histories of the telescope you read are about astronomy. I mean, they tell you about, we discovered, we got to see the moon and Venus and all these kinds of things. But when you go back to some of the original texts written about telescopy, the innovators were talking about military technology. That was actually what they were pitching to their benefactors, and the telescope has played a very significant military role. So there's many examples of this, I think, where we've kind of forgotten or fallen by the wayside in the narrative, in our technological narratives, are the historical origin, or the military origin of many of these technologies. Yeah. To rebound on the question of the military and civilian, I think this is really one of the very kind of burning issues that we need to grapple with today, which is to think about this relationship between military and civilian. I mean, we know, of course, since the 20th century that the nature of military innovation has required the involvement of universities, of what people have called the military-industrial complex, that it reaches way beyond the conventional military to many other aspects of society, and indeed, as I say, the book tries to show this entanglement. But I think we are in a new stage now. I think we're in a time where those boundaries are really much harder to police than they ever were, and it I think it's becoming more and more difficult to identify where the military stops and ends. And part of that is also reflected by the change in the institutional culture. You know, the military used to be a very discrete, kind of a distinctive body, which had its own rules, which its kind of own ethos, and that was quite distinct from civilian life. But if you look at the way in which a lot of military organizations operate today, the boundaries with civilian life has significantly eroded. Most of the jobs within the military, in a military organization, are almost indistinguishable from civilian jobs. When you think that most people are working in, administration, logistics, and so on, that actually the fighting forces are a fraction of military institutions. That the logistical chains are massive, and that the same kinds of principles apply in civilian and military context, and that within these institutions, the institutional cultures have changed very much. They're much less based on this kind of traditional model of authority. It's become much more consensual, much more open to, women, homosexuals, various forms of there's no longer that kind of monolithic military identity, and it's a much more collaborative, civilian type environment. So that, I think, contributes to the blurring of these boundaries, and an increasing inability to distinguish. It would be quite hard today to identify spheres of civilian life that are not connected in some way or other to the military.
I mean, I think I read somewhere about the American military that if you include, so who has access to classified, a certain level of classified access on their intranet or whatever, it's something like it's millions of people that have access to that, which but the American aspect of it, I don't want to belabor this point, but it seems quite strong that there's a sort of American ideological aspect to military development almost globally.
There is, for sure. But the book is historical, so I think one of the things also. So this focus on the United States, which undoubtedly is the case in the book, certainly from the second half of the 20th century onwards and to the present day, that's also, I think, partly conditioned by the fact that the US military and its history is much more transparent. I've often found when writing about the period of Cold War, being frustrated that I cannot really replicate what I've found for the US for the Soviet Union, because that information is probably not available. If it is, it's of course in Russian, but I suspect to a large extent it's just classified in simply beyond access. And that remarkably, in fact, that the US has produced or has released a huge amount of its declassified material online. Most of it, there's a colossal amount of information from studies conducted in the 1960s to military manuals for systems operating in Vietnam that have been scanned and uploaded directly for public access on the internet, and that's quite formidable. And I have to say that the work I've done with the two books, as a matter of fact, would have been impossible without the internet. Amazing. Because it's not, as you've observed, it's quite far wide ranging and it moves quite fast. What I didn't do is spend months and months in archives. Right. What I did was to kind of to use kind of search engines to connect things together, and that would be much harder if all of that was not made available online. So I think when we think about the impact of the internet on our culture, I think one of the effects of it, and I think on the whole there's a positive effect, is that it's allowing different forms of research, different forms of it's producing a kind of much more reticular culture where you can just connect distant things together. So for the kind of work that I'm doing, I think that's invaluable, because it means I can dig into areas that I don't really know about and very quickly get to working understanding of it. If I was thinking about how I would do this in the pre-internet age, I would have to go to a library and speak to a librarian, and they would tell me, well, there's one book on.
You'd be a different person,
right? Well,
very different researcher.
It would be a different kind of researcher. Yeah. The same book would take 2 or 3 times as long,
impossible, yeah.
or more realistically, you wouldn't do it.
But that again speaks to something that's really come out of America. I mean, if we consider the internet, I mean, for a long time, some people said the internet. Oh, remember that the internet is a military technology that's been given to the civilians. For a while, that was pretty uncool to say, because it was just an excuse of why the internet might be bad. But now, I think we know it's certainly the case. But there is this idea of putting things, open source, putting things out into the open, and see what comes back. That the U.S. I don't know if it's a kind of it's not. It doesn't seem to be a top-down strategy, but it is the kind of a modus operandi of military thinking.
Yes, I mean I don't have any insight into the thinking, but it seems to be the case, because it's not, the equivalent cannot be found from other European countries. So the British government or military has not done anything remotely on that scale. I don't see the same either coming out of France. It seems that in the US, at least whether it's in the military or the government more widely, there are people being paid to scan stuff and just stick it out there on the off chance that it has some effect. So I'm grateful for that. But that, going back to your original question, I think that kind of biases the research a bit, because it means that's what's, it's just like fossil records. Right? The things that leave fossils we know about. Those that don't leave fossils we don't. So it's much harder to know what the Soviet Union did, let alone what Russia's doing today. Similarly, I think for China, they're even notwithstanding the linguistic barriers, I think these are much more closed societies. And much more protective of that kind of information. But at least there's a virtue in that we the relative transparency gives us insights that we wouldn't otherwise have.
Gives us a good excuse to talk about your book.
Mm-hmm.
The China thing's interesting because since if they get cut off from the open source world of Android, maybe they're going to build their own operating system, and will that be open source? But let's leave it there.
Yes.
I was really, really interested in the move between the so we're talking about mapping. I'm talking about mapping. You talk about the understanding of the map by the military in a kind of in a communications theory, an information theory framework. So there's that. So you've got a diagram of Claude Shannon's general communication system, which is adopted for the map by Antoine Kalashny, which I thought was really fascinating. Can you talk a bit about the map as an information system? So,
again, when I approached the question of the map, I wanted to, mark a difference with what a lot of work in critical cartography has produced. So, the field of geography has gone through a phase where, there was a kind of critical insurgency, if you want, against the schools of scientific mapping, which held a quite naive view of maps as just representing reality. And critical geographers wanted to point out, I think correctly, that in any map there are various kinds of values embedded in it in terms of what it represents and what it doesn't, that there's a kind of rhetoric to the map that reflects social biases, and that can also serve to arrayify those social biases. And I think that's all very valid, but I think the risk of that critique is that it kind of abandons the terrain entirely to the classical geographers or cartographers in terms of thinking the map in its functional purposes. That's to say, maps are not just tools of propaganda. They absolutely can be, of course, but they are also instruments of power. If you are a military general, you don't want to fight with a propagandistic map. You want to fight with, when I say an accurate map, it's not to say that there's a one map that represents reality. You want a map that will help you do what you want to do, right? And as a military commander, you're going to want a map that allows you to deploy your forces on the ground, find accommodating terrain, etc., etc. So it's to think about, again, the map and its functional purpose, and that maps serve particular uses within wider assemblages. So to get to your point, I think there's an important way in which maps are cognitive supports. They're ways in which we are able to enrich our kind of cognitive operations, in particularly in this instance in navigating space. Again, to draw the contrast with the kind of conventional critical geography, when we look at the Mercator map is a kind of famous projection of the world that effectively depicts it in ways that we're familiar today. Criticisms will, in the 1960s were emitted to say, well, this is a Eurocentric map. For one, it represents Europe in the center, which is a fair point, but it also represents the shapes of continents and the sizes of continents in ways that make, again, to the benefit of the Northern Hemisphere. Again, this critique, I think, is valid, but what it forgets is that one of the reasons why this projection was chosen was as a navigational aid, that the superiority of the Mercator map relative to other navigational maps at the time was that you could draw lines of constant bearing as straight lines on the map. And it did this because the projection did the work for you. So effectively it freed up cognitive capability for navigators. It facilitated what they did. So the Mercator map is not merely a symbolic representation of, say, European colonialism and imperialism, but also an actual instrument of it, because it made navigation easier. It made exploration and conquest easier. So I think it's useful to think about maps in this sense, to think about how they operate as functional components of wider assemblages, how they can be used to calculate movements in space. And I talk about the use of the map by Napoleon in the Napoleonic campaigns, where a number of innovations came about, and again the ways in which battles would be kind of played out in advance using maps as these kinds of cognitive supports. And to get finally to the point that you're raising, this shift in the second half of the 20th century, I think what we see in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, is that this understanding of the map as an information device becomes formalized, because until the development of the information sciences, there wasn't really the language to understand what I've been talking about, or at least to have a kind of self-awareness of this. I think that becomes much clearer with the information sciences.
So you think that prior to that, people did look at it, even the practitioners of cartography looked at it as a sort of a real representation in a sense?
Well, I think obviously someone like Mercator would have understood the kind of cognitive benefits of the maps that they were producing. So I'm not saying that they would have understood the functional purposes of maps. Quite to the contrary. All I'm saying is that until the advent of the language of information, we don't really have the categories for the next level of abstraction. And I think this point about information is one that has much greater, more valid purchase. We're used to talking about everything in terms of information today, and to read history back through that lens. But prior to the formulation of that concept, that wasn't a category that could be effectively wielded, and more importantly, that allowed very disparate areas of activity to be thought of as being expressions of that same process. Yeah. I mean, this I think is the major contribution of people like Norbert Wiener or Claude Shannon, and why I think our contemporary culture is so tributary to that kind of conceptual breakthrough of the early 20th century, which again emerges particularly in the context of war. So again, we should be mindful of the ways in which war shapes this. When you mentioned the Kalasny diagram, where effectively what Kalasny does is take Shannon's diagram about information transmission and think of it in terms of the map, thinking in terms of how the map is a medium of communication, how it allows or how it seeks to transmit information in the mind of the map maker into the mind of the map user. But I think what's interesting beyond this kind of so this phase in which the map starts to be imagined as an informational channel in a way is a precursor to what happens then when the map becomes the geographic information system. When once the map is thought of as a medium for information, eventually what maps devolve to is the information.
Yeah, there's that moment. There's a moment where there were maps and people were involved in navigation using actual maps, and then suddenly it shifts into the GIS system. There's a great book. I don't know if you've read it. Hutchinson, Cognition in the Wild.
Yes.
I think he's writing in the 90s or something, but he takes a ride on a Navy boat, and he talks about the distributed cognition of navigation in the U.S. Navy. And it's a completely fascinating book, but what's doubly fascinating is that it's outdated the day after it's published, in a way, right?
And I owe a lot to Hutchinson's writings, actually, because I think he really... This idea of distributed cognition, the way in which cognition is not something that just happens in our heads, but in an exchange with our environment, I think is key.
The externalization of cognition.
Right. That from earliest kind of humans, cognition is something that happens in a relationship with our environment, with material objects. Think about the technology of writing. The fact that you can externalize thought means that you can expand thought in ways that would have been impossible otherwise.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very important way to think about things, and notably to think about the map in this sense, that the map is should ultimately stands for not just a kind of piece of paper, but for a much wider set of techniques of spatial representation with which we combine in order to produce tasks of geospatial reasoning.
There's a great quote here. It's McEachran and Crack. Maps are no longer conceived as simply graphical representations of geographic space, but as dynamic portals to interconnected, distributed geospatial data resources. Yeah, which kind of it comes back to a haunting question I've got for a lot of discussion around information technology and prosthetics, because it strikes me that if what we're saying, a sort of an externalization of cognitive processes is not necessarily a prosthetic for a self-determining subject. It's something else, isn't it?
Well, that is one of the big questions. We are kind of a prosthetic species in the sense that, well, there perhaps are some precursors in other species. We rather quite uniquely have externalized so much of our minds and our social organization into material objects. But I agree that kind of prosthetics often means that we think of it entirely as an extension of ourselves.
As an extension of the individual.
Right, as an extension of the individual, whereas certainly more so than ever, it's not merely about a projection of ourselves onto the world, but also the ways in which the world enters us.
Or a crystallization of the collective, in a sense,
right.
Collective cognition. This is the sort of Bernard Stiegler kind of moment, yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
There was an interesting. I don't have the quote, but there was an interesting comment from one of your sources that was saying that, talking about a strategic gap between military computer mapping and academic research on mapping. Do you think is that the case, or is it really entwined?
So I think the quote you're referring to was the fact that we know again very little about the military history of computer geographic information systems. So again, I mean, this strikes me again and again when I approached the book. In many ways, I was looking for, well, has someone written a book about the military map? And actually, there's quite little, especially in the kind of more contemporary period. It's very dispersed, and I had to kind of aggregate a lot of things. And what is quite clear is that there's bits and pieces of people who've done research, but a lot of things haven't been done. Some of it is because the information is not available. Some of it, I think, is because in the academic field, the military stuff has just been left to military historians who have their own kinds of questions and interests and often quite narrow. But partly in the context of the informational geographic information system, if you read like a textbook within the field geographic information systems, the history is very cursory and is very civilian, and that clearly doesn't tell the whole story, because large elements of this technology were developed within the US military, within the defense sector, within the intelligence sector, and then trickled out. And so our histories sometimes have to be revisited, because they're very partial or sanitized in terms of understanding where that technology comes from. And so, of course, sometimes it may be very difficult because the information isn't available, but that gap is something that we probably need to attend to a great extent.
I was struck by you're quoting Nigel Thrift here about a world just coming into existence, one which is based on continuous calculation and at each and every point along each and every line of movement, so bringing with it a form of spatial awareness. So you have the sense that, and reading what you've brought together about mapping, but also other conversations of mapping, that the military perception of the map and its relation to the battlefield is of a kind of so there's a sort of, it's a complicated thought. Sorry, there's an attempt to, because so in one sense a map can be seen as a static kind of representation of a highly contingent and mutable reality, which of course the GIS system and particularly military systems now are trying to overcome. But at the same time, so in a sense they're trying to use a limited scope of representation to represent with fidelity a changing chaotic reality, a kind of ubiquitous relation to IRL, to in real life. I guess the question I had with more globally is, in those kind of endeavors of ubiquitous knowledge of basically what's going on right now, what did the military lose epistemologically by trying to gain this ubiquitous geospatial knowledge?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I think that one thing that's going on with mapping today is that the map used to be, or the activity of mapping used to be, a second order process. You went out, you made a map, and then it was a kind of fixed picture of a particular incident in time, and that map might be used, it might be kind of manually updated, but eventually you'd have to go through the whole process again. I think we're now converging on a point where mapping is something that is synchronous with our exploration of space in real time. In other words, mapping is synchronous with reality. And think about, to go to the Thrift quote. I mean, Thrift, I think, is pointing out, for instance, the use of GPS tracking. The fact that our representations there's virtually no distinction between our representations and the real that they purport to be representing. Maps are being produced in the moment, on the fly. When autonomous systems are navigating space, they are producing maps that they're at the same time as they're navigating those maps.
But surely there is a distinction between what. So first of all, is what the sensors can get, and there's also the capacity to represent it to a limited perception of a human, right?
Well, it's not that the map contains everything, but that to shift to a different example. When you think about social networks, the social network is the social network. It's not an abstraction of the network. It is what it is, and the collection of, or the stream of data points, of GPS data points, and real-time photogrammetry is the sum of these things. And in terms of the kind of functional universe in which it operates, it is its own world.
Well, that's fascinating, because then it becomes a sort of topological universe, which is separate from the sort of topographical reality that it has a relation to.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, your question your original question is a complicated one. So what is being lost? I mean, what's being gained, of course, is some sense of ubiquitous and kind of omniscient kind of representation of the world. But I suppose one of the perils of that might be a kind of presentism that goes with that, and an ability to step back from that to draw out perhaps to discriminate between the really important information, the really important relations, and the flotsam of data that just kind of keeps flowing through.
Yeah, but what's interesting to consider there is that I mean, the social network was a good analogy, because if the social network is the social network, okay, it might have a relation to actual people that know each other, but not entirely. It's its own thing. So before the social network, there wasn't a social network.
The social network is not a representation of society in any way, obviously not.
It's just the social network.
But it is a representation. It is, just a recording of people's interactions on the social network.
But just as the social network has created a new social world, in a sense, the kind of ubiquitous mapping, real-time mapping that goes on, is creating a new world.
Right.
And in distinction from the old static map, which you couldn't really operate on, these maps are actually operational. So if Farooqi says operational images, this is in a sense operational cartography.
I suppose you could operate on the old maps as well, in the sense that you would draw on them, you would cast orders of schemes for battle. And on digital versions of these, they might be, because the digital version could still be a static map. These can still be used for georeferenced navigation and so on. Missile technologies such as cruise missiles make use of that. What I think is the most kind of salient feature of the GIS is that the map user becomes the map maker. That the sense is that the map is never fixed. It's always being updated through the actions of the operator, who may be simply changing the representations, or in fact adding information to it, or just the flows of information that keep coming in that are updated. So there's no version of the map, or there's no kind of static version of the map. There's just a flux of data which will be punctually represented to us or to the machines that need them.
Well, by and large, with both autonomous devices, but also, I mean, the distance at which things happen these days. I mean, the pilot of a F-16 is not usually going to see the target. It becomes that the map is actually the battlefield. You don't need to even have the indexed reference of the non-map, the world.
Yes, the imaging and the mapping dimension of things also collapses, in the sense that the map is also an image, but it's also an image that could be potentially explored. You can produce a three-dimensional version of that of the map that you might immerse yourself in, which might be the space of the drone operator or whatever it might be. So, when talking about these activities of sensing, imaging, and mapping, what I think one of the things that we see is that the information feedback loops between them become so tight and so rapid that effectively these activities blend into one, and it becomes very difficult to even identify them as distinct operations.
And the science fiction writer in me wants to imagine the world of the map, where all kinds of operations are happening and have absolutely zero relation to any kind of real.
Well, and of course the map could reference non-physical spaces, right? We think about mapping as well as the mapping of relationships and so on. This is something I try to bracket out, because just
I mean, social networks.
For instance, yes, exactly. One can think about social network.
Well, I mean, but this is part of what's mapped. The military maps social networks, but that's not the kind of map that we're talking about.
No, and I think, but again, the question then becomes the question of abstraction. Yeah. And that's of course key in the question of cognitive operations. You don't want to operate on all the data. You want to operate on selected amounts of these data, aggregated forms of data, correlated forms of data, so that what's drawn to your attention is the relationships that matter to you as the decision maker,
right?
Or the operative mechanism of a machine. So some of these relationships will be predetermined by the designers of these systems. Others will be produced on the fly by the users, who will be reasoning about them.
I'm conscious that I've taken up a lot of your time.
Okay.
But to move on to hiding, I found this was, I don't know why, but I found this was like a really entertaining section. I thought it was fascinating, and curious about the relation of perception to hiding. So I hadn't thought about it before, obviously, but obviously to hide is a form of perception, at least the perception that someone is watching. And I remember now playing hide and seek as a kid. The best strategy was to always be visually aware of where the seeker was and moving around to be always behind them. So, and the worst is to sort of like close your eyes and sit in a closet. That's the worst strategy of hiding. So maybe you can talk a bit about the relation of hiding to perception.
Well, yes, I think we can think about hiding as an anticipation of perception. To conceal yourself, to best conceal yourself, you have to put yourself in the eyes of the seeker, if you want. And this whole section on hiding, I think, was critical for the book, because although hiding is a kind of second order manifestation, if we want, of the logistics of perception, the function, the operation of the logistics of perception can be thought of as happening within sensing, imaging, and mapping. Hiding is critical because it covers really the counter conduct of it, and is very specific, or at least heightened in the context of war, which is an adversarial relation. And it's key, of course, because the various activities that come under hiding are also the spur for the development of the logistics of perception. So there's this perceptual arms race between hiders and seekers, where ever new means of concealment produces new means of perception. So in the context of war, it's quite clear that concealment and deception and so on have always been part of the activity of war, but become much more urgent from the early 20th century onwards, when the means of perception and correlated means of targeting become such that remote targeting is gains in lethality and range, and where increasingly it matters more not to be seen. If you think about the armies of the past, prior to the 20th century, I think of European history at any rate, we can think of very brightly coloured uniforms, Napoleonic forces and so on, and the idea here was to be conspicuous, to be visible, to be impressive for psychological reasons, to build a kind of pride in the uniform that was seen to be virtuous, but also to allow the commanders to know where their troops were, because that was the problem, the biggest problem. Right. The bigger problem from the First World War onwards is that if you can be seen, you can be targeted. And so we see khaki uniforms being adopted very quickly in the First World War, camouflage patterning becoming increasingly sophisticated, all again in the attempt to conceal, and all based more or less haphazard, but nonetheless over time increasingly scientific way, in a way of anticipating perception. How does the human eye see? How does the photographic lens see? Right. And what are the various measures we can implement in order to conceal, disguise, mislead?
Yeah, your section on camouflage, it's kind of funny. It's almost comedic, because I think in the end none of it really works very well.
The evidence for how successful camouflage is or was is checkered, for sure. I think it's, in the First World War and in part of the Second World War, a lot of it was probably a bit talismanic. Let's paint camouflage and just hope that works. Nonetheless, I think camouflage has grown in sophistication, and some of it evidently works to a degree, obviously. Yeah. And has taken on its own kind of symbolic character. Right now, to be military is to be in camouflage fatigues.
Yeah. I was just yesterday in Brighton, and I went into one of these sort of vintage military shops. I was looking at the military jackets. I couldn't get myself to sort of I couldn't put myself in camouflage, but it is pretty cool looking.
Again, the aesthetics, right, that are on the one hand incidental because they are supposed to be entirely functional, but are not entirely incidental because they speak about the kind of sartorial image of the military. And I talk at some length about the debacle of the universal camouflage pattern that the US military tried to adopt in the early 2000s, where they went for a deliberately pixelated pattern, for which there was some scientific basis for, but ultimately they implemented it in a completely flawed way, and that it seems that the main reason why they adopted it was primarily because they thought we're a digital army, so we should have digital camo.
They thought it looked cool.
They thought it looked cool, effectively, and then effectively had to ditch all the uniforms at the cost of billions of dollars, because it turned out it worked completely at cross purposes.
But that's just an amazing anecdote. Now, there's another really great one where you talk about the development, or I don't know if it's actually ongoing, but active camouflage. So from what I understand, someone's wearing something which makes them blend seamlessly into wherever they are, let's say like tucked into a couple of rocks. But you need to know where the perceiver is in order to understand what to project.
Yeah.
Which just sounded like a really funny kind of mindfuck.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, it's the basic ideas, of course, is a kind of invisibility cloak.
Yeah.
So ways by which you could produce camouflage that would change in accordance with the environment, and some of the ways in which it's conceived to be would be through the projection of images that would imitate the background. But as you say, that would be a perspectival image, so ultimately you would have to be standing in the right place.
Right. Yeah.
So how that would work is unclear. I think a lot of this active camouflage techniques are none of them are really prime time, but the logic. And part of what they try to do in the book is just to identify the underlying logic. It's quite clear that is the way to go. Whether that can be achieved now in 50 years or 100 years is anyone's guess, and the technology that might be used could be in fact far more fantastical than image projection. They might involve quantum physics and other kind of strange metamaterials. Nobody, at this point, none of this stuff is really outside of the kind of laboratory.
Right.
But it will clearly become an ever larger priority.
Yeah. Well, it strikes me that there's probably a distinction between the kind of camouflage that that the U.S. military or a military would imagine for itself in relation to a peer conflict. Peer conflict being an army that's like them, and the types of camouflage that someone like the Mumbai attackers or the would be using. So these are two different methods of hiding, because in one you are hiding and you're looking at the person you're hiding from. So it's an arms race of perception, clearly, because you're both trying to perceive the other. But in the other, the asymmetrical version, there is another kind of hiding.
So there's if you think about the way in which camouflage is deployed in conventional military conflicts, there is a way in which it's quite significantly bounded, because in the end, even if you wear a camouflage uniform, you're still wearing a uniform. The idea is, if you abide by international conventions, that in order to be a recognized military, you must appear as one. In other words, you must wear uniforms that identify you as a soldier, that identify what forces you're in, and so on. But of course, there is a much more radical form of camouflage available, which is to conceal entirely your presence as a hostile force. And this is what I call, drawing on Reza Negrestani's work, hypercamouflage. And the suggestion here is that one of the consequences of the increasing transparency of the battle space is to invite, particularly from asymmetric actors, which cannot compete on the technological field, is to adopt radical forms of concealment, whereby you blend yourself in as much as possible into enemy populations, civilian populations. You do not announce your presence until the last minute, and that's a logic of, you could say, much contemporary terrorism, which clearly is something we're observing right now, and is likely to intensify. And I think is one of the I think the book tries to point out that in a way there's one of the unintended consequences of this quest for ever greater discriminate military perception is that the means of concealment will become ever more radical, and in doing so might entirely dissolve the boundaries between military and civilian spheres in ways that are likely to be very uncomfortable for the most advanced states.
Yeah, and this is an amplification. I mean, because I think it was Saddam Hussein, I think it was your book, sort of the idea to sort of stand up against the American military was the last time that's going to happen, right? Because we saw what happened to them. So increasingly, you will never announce your presence, and as a consequence, the militaries, like the U.S. military, will have to go in to, well, either they go into a kind of a human intelligence operation, or they don't at all, and they stay on the kind of the topological cartographic level, right?
So as I said earlier, war is an adversarial relationship, and you have to always, I think, be mindful that if a particular side acquires a very clear dominance in one field or in one mode of war, then it becomes entirely rational and very probable that what resourceful adversaries will do is change the rules of the game. They will not play by a game that they have no chances of prevailing in. And we see this already. That literally since the first Gulf War, no one has tried to take on the US in a conventional conflict, and everyone who has taken on the US has done so in some form of asymmetry, more or less successfully, but in fact to a significant effect, effectively denying the US any clear strategic victory for the last 2 decades. War kind of the dominance of one particular military or one particular way of fighting will secrete almost mechanically alternative, a countermeasure to it that will resist or shift the terrain of war away from the hegemon's threats.
Yeah. You end on, I mean, you don't end, but I think your conclusion has this great quote from Foucault. The gaze that sees is the gaze that dominates, and although it also knows how to submit itself, it dominates its masters.
So I mean, there's two things I try to allude to in the conclusion. One is that one of the consequences of what I would call the dissolution of the battlefield, the fact that military global targeting, which is effectively one of the things that emerges as a consequence of omnipresent perception, has an effect of rendering the battlefield global, meaning anywhere in the world could be potentially targeted in a drone strike or whatever other means of modern technology. Simultaneously, the countermeasures that we've just discussed, the radicalization of dissimulation, also disintegrates the boundaries between war and peace. And one of the effects of that will likely mean in our societies that the logistics of perception, or what I call the martial gaze, will turn inwards, that increasingly our societies are going to be submitted to ever more monitoring precisely because of this radical dissimulation. So there's the technology that were initially developed to face outwards, if you want, are likely to come home to roost, and that the increasing securitization of our societies is a correlate of the disappearance of the battlefield. The second kind of aspect, which I think the quote you just mentioned from Foucault resonates with, is the kind of insistent, gnawing question throughout the book, I think, about what happens to human agents within increasingly sophisticated socio-technical assemblages of perception. If indeed technology is not merely a prosthetic, but a milieu in which we operate, then increasingly I would contend it has become and is becoming ever more difficult to locate clearly the sites of military agency. Increasingly we're talking about distribution rather than concentration into individual hands, and that of course raises bigger questions ultimately about the general direction of our technological societies and the beings within them.
It's great, and it also responsibilizes us, because we are the masters. In a way, we have to take responsibility for being the masters of the stuff that comes back.
I mean, I think one of the things that I think is I drew from the book as well, from the study is, we there's been a lot of discussion about lethal autonomous weapon systems, thinking about the important, the killer robots and so on. And I think there's an important debate to be had about that. But I think that kind of misses the mark, because in a way, when we're talking about lethal autonomous systems, I think that on the one hand, it underestimates the technological obstacles. I think that AI really isn't quite at the stage to be able to produce reliable systems, certainly ones that militaries would be happy to put out there. And in fact, there's quite considerable resistance within militaries who are unsurprisingly not that keen on fielding systems that they can't really control. And because of that, I think that we have a kind of more pressing issue, which is that probably long before autonomous weapon systems really reach the battlefield, we are going to be, if we're not already, in a position where the urgent question is, where is the site of decision making? Where is the site of agency? In fact, I can quite conceive of military institutions keeping humans in the loop for the foreseeable future, because it will be better for them to have a human to which they can point and say, well, this individual pushed the button. And so therefore, if we're looking for someone responsible, particularly with now chains of accountability and so on, we can point to this person. But in what sense is that individual an agent if their grasp of the battlefield has been entirely mediated through these various technical apparatus? If the decisions they've taken have been heavily guided and oriented by these technical systems, it will seem to be very arbitrary to call what they're doing meaningful control, which is what the advocates of control over autonomous weapon systems call for. They say we need to keep meaningful control, but it strikes me that it's very difficult to operationalize that concept of meaningful control, and indeed it is increasingly meaningless to speak about human control, at least according to the classical image of the sovereign human subject.
Arbitrary decision making within a distributed system of control requires a legal attribute of responsibility at some point.
That's how our societies work, and this is one of the problems that's been raised about autonomous weapon systems, is that if an autonomous weapon system commits a war crime, who's in the dock? Is it the drone itself? Is it the manufacturer, the programmer, the last human who had something to do with it? These are difficult questions. There are no easy answers to them. But I note as well that even when we think about autonomous weapon systems, in a way, our thinking is completely conditional on thinking about autonomy in terms of a human subject. We think, oh, well, the drone is the equivalent of human subject, but that's not what a drone would be. A drone would be also a distributed autonomy.
It's the big misconception,
right?
Isn't it? Yeah.
So I think we need to reflect more on what autonomy means in the first place, and in fact the problems that we're facing with regard to military systems is a much more difficult and thorny one than the spectre, however terrifying, of killer robots.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Let's end it there.
Great.
It's been great. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.